Just a real quick, a couple of our upcoming events. Our Arizona Historical Society, our mission is connecting people through the power of Arizona's history. So it's great to be able to bring people together. And this presentation, as well as Monday's presentation, is part of the Colorado River Days, which brings a little science in, which is so much fun to do. Riordan Mansion State Historic Park is currently closed, including the grounds. Sorry. Once we know we have a reopen date, it will get blasted out to everybody. Our partner museum, the Pioneer Museum, the buildings are closed, but you can walk those grounds Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5. The Resilience exhibit, Women of Flagstaff's Past and Present, is on display at Pioneer Museum, but since you can't get into the building, you can go online and you can read all the exhibit panels. And if you want more Arizona history, visit the Arizona Historical Society website and visit the Arizona History Digital Hub. All kinds of great activities there, as well as recordings and handouts, all kinds of great stuff. Monday, we have our lunchtime lecture, and that is on the ecology of the Colorado River and results of bug flow monitoring. And for all of you people that have done some citizen science on the river, this is the results. So it's super exciting to see what all that work is turned into. Statewide, Arizona Historical Society has a couple other presentations coming up. On September 7th, Arizona History Now Monuments and Memorials virtual event. And then on September 29th, Women in the Classroom. Make sure to check out our Facebook page for the Pioneer Museum, Arizona Historical Society, and Riordan Mansion events are posted here as well. And Riordan Mansion events Facebook page is run by our friends group, Riordan Action Network. And of course, next week starts the best 10 days of the year, the Flagstaff Festival of Science. And for those of you that are all across the country, because I know we've got people from all over the place this time, you get to take advantage of it because a lot of the festival is virtual this year. So check it out. Of course, our logo, that fancy X, is the alchemist symbol for ancient alchemist symbol for copper. So it's always fun to share that with people. We've got a lot of great people helping us out and making things happen. And so these are some of those great organizations that we partner with. And you know, if you're, especially once we reopen and you want to get into our museums, consider getting a membership. In the meantime, you can get the membership includes the Journal of Arizona History. And you don't want to miss anything, make sure to sign up for the newsletter on our website, azhs.org. And I know it skipped real quick. Grand Canyon people, I know you're here tonight. If you have not seen the special edition journal on the Grand Canyon National Park, it is out there. You can check it out on the website. And if you need a hard copy, call over to Pioneer Museum and they'll help you out with curbside pickup. Okay, I'm gonna stop my share and I'm going to hand it over to Tom Martin because he's the one you're here all here to see tonight, and I'm so excited to have you here. And as always, we're ready for a nice ride down the river. Now I'm going to turn off my camera and mute myself. Use that chat feature. Put your questions in there. When we get to the end of the presentation, we'll start with the questions in chat to start off the Q&A. Thank you, and Tom, it's all yours.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks to Sasha. I should be sharing my screen. Do you see that?
Yes.
All right. And thank you all so much for showing up tonight. Chances are you did come here for the presentation on the wind and the willow, so we better change that, and I'll hit the button and see what happens. And nothing's happening, so you're gonna love these sorts of things. Something did happen that time. All right. Well, again, this is a presentation on 13,500 years of Grand Canyon river running in 50 minutes. So right away, you know there's going to be trouble. And I'm going to leave out a lot of stuff. A lot of well-known river runners. I'm not even going to talk about. What I am going to talk about tonight is hopefully some material about river running on the Colorado River in Grand Canyon that you've never heard of before. So let's give it a go, see what happens. Again, I want to thank Nikki Lober and Sasha Skonen for their help tonight. If you have questions, please put them in chat, and Sasha and Nikki will field those out to me at the end of this presentation. What I can't do tonight is I can't hear you laughing, but this presentation hopefully will have you bursting out every now and then, just to keep you engaged. It's kind of fun. And this is a fundraiser for the Riordan Mansion. And the way the fundraiser works is through the folks at Vishnu Temple Press, Hazel Clark, my wife, and myself. We've got a bunch of books. John Fuller has just put out the Gila River Elegy to go with his Verde River Elegy. Really great books on the Gila and the Verde. I really recommend them. Chuck Luttrell's Craftsman Work Here is a book about maintenance in the national parks. We hear about national park rangers, but we don't hear a lot about maintenance folks. If you're a fan of Brighty of the Grand Canyon, then you might want to look at Bobby Brighty and the Wiley Way, the true story of Brighty, the little burro on the North Rim of Grand Canyon. Of course, Bev Kurtz, wonderful compendium of river running stories, Why We Boat. There's more river running history there. We'll talk about that tonight. There's a bunch of river guides and all kinds of other books. And if you order books from VishnuTemplePress.com for the next week, the proceeds of those sales go to the Riordan Mansion. So that's how the fundraiser works. And I think history is important, and I think supporting our local historical societies is important as well. So with that, thank you all for coming, and let's climb in the boat here. I'm supposed to be looking confident, and you as the passengers are supposed to be a little, maybe some trepidation going on here. I want to mention that different people approach history differently. And there are people who approach history from a legend standpoint. Walt Disney's 10 Who Dare come to mind. It takes the Pahl story and turns it on its head and shakes it. Also, history can be written by the victors, and that typically leaves out the losers. And I'm not real keen on that either, because I think the loser story is important. I'm interested in the facts, and the facts can be very, well, they can stink. They can be stinky. And so here's our skunk looking at the facts as they compare to the legends and the history, and we'll do a little bit of that tonight. So we're talking about the Colorado River. And let's take a little tour from the headwaters to the Sea of Cortez, just so you can kind of get a sense of the place here. 1,450 miles long, almost a quarter million square miles of the drainage. It's a big place, mostly desert, low desert, medium desert, and high desert. Here's the basin, and there are two major tributaries, the Green River, and until the 1920s, the Grand River. And then the Grand River's name was changed in 1921 to the Colorado River. And so it joined the rest of the basin here. And yes, we're going to talk about river running in Grand Canyon, but I can't avoid the rest of the basin. So we'll take a little tour now. And we'll start at the Wind Rivers at the headwaters of the Green. And I know there's some people here tonight from the headwaters. You may be from the Green, but you may be from the Colorado or the San Juan. There's a lot of headwaters out there of this river. Quickly, the river drops down into the high desert and passes Green River, Wyoming. And this is where John Wesley Powell launched his trip in 1869. Because there was a put-in, the Transcontinental Railroad had just steamed through and put up a trestle here and a crossing. So Powell could get the boats here to the put-in and head downriver. Downstream from Green River, Wyoming, down through Red Canyon and Hideout and all those wonderful places that are under Flaming Gorge Dam is the Gates of Lodore. And there be wicked rapids in there called Hell's Half Mile and Disaster Falls. And I don't know why river runners name rapids with terrifying names. It doesn't help the runs go any better. But, you know, this is Lodore. There's rapids in there. And then down through Whirlpool and Split Mountain, off into the hot, stinking Uinta Basin, 100 miles of flat water. No wonder the Pahl expedition had a hard time getting food in here. And then you go into wonderful Desolation and Gray Canyons. It's desert, but there's a wonderful riparian corridor along the river with big cottonwood trees, and it's really beautiful. Down below Desolation and Gray, you head into Labyrinth and Stillwater Canyons, and the sandstones start showing up. It's really beautiful country. Then you get to the confluence of, again, up until 1921, the confluence of the Grand River and the Green. Today, it's the confluence of the Green and the Colorado. And downstream from the confluence is Cataract Canyon and a rapid called Satan's Gut and all that stuff, but we won't worry about that. And below Cataract Canyon is sinuous, sultry, seductive Glen Canyon. Just 170 miles of just gorgeous, gorgeous country, which is now under the waters impounded behind Glen Canyon Dam. And downstream below that is, of course, Grand Canyon. I live in Flagstaff, so this is not too far from us here. Down below the Grand Canyon is Topak Gorge, and the river ran all the way out to the Sea of Cortez. And I was just looking at some correspondence in 1959. River runners had realized, oh, you know, the river doesn't always get to the Sea of Cortez. That was 1959, so you had to head out on the high water. Hoover Dam would be releasing enough, and all the other dams releasing enough to actually get some water to the Sea of Cortez. So we need to understand that for the first 13,000 years, there were countless unnamed First Nations peoples tribes in the Colorado River drainage. And by the time people started counting, there were 30. So before those 30, there were many, many. And just like the rest of us as a species, the First Nations people love to play with boats. And we need to recognize that. So here's a compendium of different types of boats. In the upper left is a skin-covered frame boat called a kayak. Today's kayak. And these boats were used in the Arctic Circle by a number of First Nation tribes, and entire groups would go from island to island every year in a whole flotilla of these boats. Absolutely amazing. The dugout canoe from all across the United States, all across the Americas. On the right, we have bull boats, a type of kayak with a skin and a frame. And in the lower left, amazingly incredible boats, the birch bark canoes, sturdy, dependable, lightweight, really amazing boats. Tonight, I want to bring your attention to the boat in the middle bottom. This is an incredible watercraft that was used by the people along the Pacific coast of North America, all the way down to Central America, still used today in Peru. Thule reed is about the diameter of your fattest finger, and it is incredibly buoyant. And the people, Amakav, the Kokopah, the Mojave, and the Gila Indians all had Thule reed boats. And the Spaniards in 1540 called the Colorado River El Rio de las Balsas, the river of boats. I want to read something here to you from the Whipple crossing of the Colorado River in 1853, 1854. The artist who made this was Bobby Mulhausen, who had a wonderful sense of humor that described the terrible time they had getting across the Colorado River in this very awkward boat that they built. which at one point tipped over completely, and all their supplies were dumped in the river. And the Mojave, who had their flexible raft that they could steer, went round and round and picked up all the supplies. And it was his conclusion that they should have hired the Mojaves in the first place, which a lot of people did. So here's a picture of a contemporary Thule raft. It's incredibly buoyant. Now you should be asking me in your little chat, well, smarty pants, besides the Hopi and the Navajo oral traditions, give me one other notice of any kind of reed boat in Grand Canyon, because this is Grand Canyon history, right? Okay, this is what I've got. George McCormick was a miner, and he was in the Grand Canyon in the 1890s. And he mentioned to his nephew the following bit of information about Nankoweap. Down around River Mile 56, a very special ruin that he had been told about was supposed to contain a boat made of some kind of rushes. I realized that Thule reed is a native to the entire Colorado River basin. That's all I've got for the first 13,000 years. But I'm saying tonight that we have a lot to learn about boating on this river. Because rafts were available as well. Now let's talk about rafts. You need to tip your hat here to Dr. Tom Myers, who's cheering everybody on a little raft. He was doing some experimenting up on the Moab Daily. People think of James White, but you need to go back before James White to 1861. This is the Johnson map of California, the New Mexico and Utah territories, which shows the Colorado River in its current location in 1861. And that year, Captain John Moss showed up. And John Thomas Moss said that in April of 1861, he went from Lee's Ferry through Grand Canyon to Fort Mojave in 3.5 days, nonstop. You know, it's really hard to sit on a log raft for a half an hour. It's really uncomfortable. To be on that thing for 3.5 days, I don't know how you'd get through Grand Canyon unless you were going on flood. Then it might work if you were really lucky. But I'm just saying, here is the first account that I can find of somebody saying they went through Grand Canyon on a log raft. In the late 1850s, Moss was living up with the Hopis and the Paiutes. And in the early 1860s, he was living with the Mojave. So that line to connect that up could go through Grand Canyon. I'm just saying. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the first documented trip through Grand Canyon, the John Wesley Powell expedition. Major Pahl and 9 others in 4 boats started, and 6 men in 2 boats cleared the Grand Canyon. 2 men in 1 boat made it all the way to the Sea of Cortez from Green River, Wyoming. That's pretty good. I wanted to mention briefly their boats. If you see a boat on dry land that's laying on its side, that's a tippy boat. It doesn't work real well. The reason I bring this up is because for the 1871-72 expedition, John Wesley Powell knew better than to use these white hulls again. How do I know that, you ask? Well, I want to introduce to you the Wheeler expedition of October 1871 at Diamond Creek. These people, Mojave, excellent swimmers and fishermen, were on this trip, had this amazing boat. They had a number of amazing boats. They were flat-bottomed, pointed at one end, square-sterned at the other, very stable boats. They portaged their boats up along the shore through the rapids, including Separation Rapid, Major Powell. You said it couldn't be done. and they downran the river from Diamond Creek 200 miles to Fort Mojave in October, not on a flood, in 5 days. So could Moss have gotten through Grand Canyon on a raft in 1871 in 3.5 days on, I don't know, 60,000 cubic feet a second? Going 10 miles an hour, he sure could have. Bunch of other river trips in here. I'm not going to talk about them, except those of you that have been through the Grand Canyon, you know that you started your river trip at Lee's Ferry. The first river trip to start at Lee's Ferry was in 1903. In 1904, John Wilbur showed up. And hopefully you haven't heard about John Wilbur. Wilbur was an amazing guy. He was trying to find vanadium in Grand Canyon, and he started at Lee's Ferry, and he made it all the way to Lava Falls, and then he sunk his canoe. Yeah, his canoe. He sunk it in Lava Falls. And he hiked out to Kanab, Utah, and got around to Peach Springs on the railroad and hiked back to Diamond Creek with another canoe and a camera. And here's a picture of Wilbur in his canoe, which they used oars and a little tiller out the back, a little paddle out the back. So this guy ran the entire Grand Canyon except for about 40 miles, about 50 miles from Lava Falls to Diamond Creek. There were a bunch of people doing partial trips in Grand Canyon. You don't know that much about them, but they're out there. Like this guy. J.H. Hummel and David Miller, they built 2 boats at Green River, Utah, and they boated these 2 boats down to the confluence where Miller's boat caught fire. How does your boat catch fire? I don't know, but it did. And Hummel kept going down through Cataract Canyon by himself. Others had done it before him, but there he went, 1914, through Glen Canyon, through Marble Canyon, into Grand Canyon, to the foot of the Bright Angel Trail. And he saw some people, and he pulled ashore, and he said, "Where am I?" And they said, "Well, this is the foot of the Bright Angel Trail." And he looked to the sky, and he said, "Praise the Lord, the Bright Angel." And he hiked out, and he left his boat to Emery Kolb and walked into the mists of time, and we've never seen him since. Here's a boat that you all might recognize from December of 1914. Yeah, somebody's got it right. It's the Ross Wheeler. In the winter of 1914, 1915, I've got a little film clip from that river trip. Let's see if it works. Oh, it's working. There's crazy Charlie Russell, crazy as a loon, shouted at things and talked to himself. Crazy guy. This is Badger Rapid. Look at the sand. That big rock in the upper left with the eyebrows that are still there. All that driftwood. This is January of 1914, and there's Crazy Charlie going down to the boats. What's he doing? Oh, there's our hero. They were making a film. They never released it. There's Charlie, he's got an axe. What's he doing? He's going after ice. The boats have frozen in the eddy. And look at the ice going round and round in the eddy here. I love these old films because they tell us so much about what the place was like before the dams. So 27 people had made the complete journey that we have documented from Lee's Ferry to Pierce Ferry by 1919, when the National Park Service showed up. And you can't talk about river history without talking about river history management. So 1919, the Park Service showed up, and they didn't spend a lot of time looking at the river to start with. I love this picture. 1923, this is Catherine Pahl on the far side and Edith Kolb on the near side, and they're stealing the boat from the USGS guys at Lee's Ferry. Go, girls, go, get away, get away. This is the first earliest picture I have of women in boats on the Colorado River anywhere near Lee's Ferry and Grand Canyon. But I bet Emma Lee, the wife of John Lee, they had a little boat, a little rowboat, and I bet she rowed it across the river quite a lot. This 1923 river trip was really fascinating because these guys ran a level line with oar boats all the way through the length of Grand Canyon. They closed within 4 feet, over 270 miles. You try that sometime. It's hard. 4 feet, that's pretty good. And that trip in 1923 produced the first maps of the Colorado River and Grand Canyon. And the era of exploration was over. The 13,403-year-old era of the unknown river ends in the era of tragedy. What? How'd you come up with these names, Martin? I didn't. Blame this guy, Otis Marston. He did. The tragic era. What is the tragic era, Otis? Well, I want to introduce to you Superintendent Minor Tillotson, an engineer who worked a couple of years at Grand Canyon before becoming superintendent in 1927. Tillotson was a really interesting fellow, had a great sense of humor, and he sent his rangers out to explore his park. Go out there and figure it out. And they did. But unfortunately, during his reign at the park, 13 people perished in and around the Colorado River. Glenn and Bessie Hyde in 1927 disappeared, not in the park, but just outside the park. And they made a big splash in the newspapers, which was still going when Tillotson's employees, Glenn Sturdivant and Fred Johnson, drowned trying to get back to Phantom Ranch, having taken that little canvas canoe that I started this presentation out with, all the way down to Trinity and back, and they died. And Bill Payne hiked in at Diamond Creek, tried to float down to Hoover Dam. Swimming fatalities, Ivan Bundy, Ken Curtis, and Wally Peshlikai. Suicide by river, Miss Ida Rusk down to Hermit Rapid. Lee's Ferry, the ferry flipped over in 1928 and drowned Royce Dean, Louis Nez, and Adolpha Johnson. And then just to get it to 13, Lafayette McDonald fell off the Navajo Bridge under construction in 1928, fell 400 feet to his death. This is why Marston calls this the era of tragedy, but you need to understand that between 1923 and 1938, 31 people made the run all the way through the canyon, and a number of people made the run partially. So it's interesting. Who were those trips? Well, here's Buzz Holmstrom talking to Frank Dodge. These two men were probably the best Grand Canyon river runners back in 1937 when Holmstrom passed Dodge's trip. It was the first time a river trip ever passed another river trip, ever, 1937. Also in 1938, the first rubber raft showed up. That's Amos Berg and his little rubber raft called Charlie. Dr. Elzada Clover ran a botanical expedition through Grand Canyon. Now, Mr. Norm Nevels painted Nevels' expedition on the side of his boats, but we need to remember this was the Clover expedition, and without her, Nevels would have never made it through the Grand Canyon. His trip would have stopped at Lee's Ferry. There's a great story about Dr. Clover. She wrote Mr. Nevels and said, Mr. Nevels, you should check with the Park Service to see if you need a permit. Mr. Nevels was taken aback, but he did as he was told, and he wrote Superintendent Tillotson on the left here, and Dr. Clover and Mr. Nevels. And Tillotson wrote Nevels, while a formal permit is not required by regulation, we naturally do all in our power to discourage such trips. Oh, I didn't know the park discouraged river trips. Well, they did. Actually, Tillotson did. because Tillotson was superintendent during the era of tragedy. Wait, what? Yeah, Tillotson banned all National Park Service employees from making any river cruise in the park during the rest of his lifetime, openly discouraging all river trips beginning in 1937, and only 4 NPS employees would participate on 4 trips between 1930 and 1955. The NPS would not return to the river by boat until 1968. Thank you, Superintendent Tillotson. So the first trip to get denied access to the park by Superintendent Tillotson was the French trio, these amazing kayakers in full boats that started in Green River, Wyoming, and wanted to go all the way to Lake Mead. That was their intention. But de Clermont, on the right, he wrote Superintendent Tillotson. He had come to the US. He had met Tillotson, stayed at his house, wrote him a letter and said, "I'd like to boat through your park. What do you got to tell me about it?" And Tillotson said, "I need a $10,000 bond from you for the rescue I know is going to be needed. And I strongly recommend that you give up any notion of making this very dangerous trip." Okay. According to Marston, the tragic era transitioned into the Neville's era in 1938 to 1949. And we can see that. Here are all the trips, and look at all these Neville's trips. Harrison Loper went through in 38, then Neville's. Hudson Marston in 49, Harris Loper in 49, Neville's in 49. Well, what happened during that period? The coolest thing happened. Alexander Zee Grant showed up with a full boat in 1941. And he linked up with Norm Neville's, and the 2 trips, they ran 2 trips. They soon became 1 trip. And when Grant's boat floated away at Waltenberg Rapid while they were scouting, forget the name of the boatman, went out and with Z, and they saved the boat. And when the trip ran out of food, Zee Grant had brought a whole bunch of dehydrated food and saved them all. It was a great combination of folks. In 1942, the first Grand Canyon youth showed up. On the right is Bruce Wilson. He's still alive today. I did an oral history with him about this 1942 trip. He's a wonderful man. And on the left is Garth Marston. He was 15, and their dads were here. Grand Canyon Youth, 1942. And then Harry Ailson and Georgie White. If there's any pack rafters tonight, you need to know that your heritage of pack rafting goes back to 1946. How cool is that? Well, the Park Service didn't like what was going down on the river, and especially this trip. And Region 3 Director Tillotson. Now, Tillotson was a superintendent, and now he's the Region 3 Director of Grand Canyon. He had proposed a rule which would prohibit people from running the rapids of the Grand Canyon unless they were able to show proper qualification. This is in July of 1946. In April of 1947, the first permit to run the river actually went to Norman Neville's. April of 1947. And then, that September, the director of the Park Service writes this memo to all national parks. "We owe it both to ourselves and the venturesome to have such control over these." I can't read that because I got my little thing in the way. What is, you guys can read it. Let's see if I can get rid of this. How do I get rid of this? Boink. Dink. Yeah. "To assert such control over these attempts as we can legally without impeding undertakings such as those conducted by Norman Neville's." Wait a minute. What? Yeah. What the Park Service is saying here is that we don't want Georgie and Harry if they're going to be down there in a pack raft. We want the commercial folks, like Norm Neville's. Who knew? I hadn't a clue. And Bryant offered Neville's a river concession and wrote, some of the wild expeditions through the canyon could be partially stopped by strict regulations demanding a permit and requirements as to the equipment and as to experienced personnel. Wow. There it is right there. I want to jump out of the entire Colorado River Basin for just a minute and let you know what was happening to river running at that time. 1940, the first National Whitewater Championship for canoe and kayak held in Middleton, Maine on the Rapid River. 1940. 1948, the Wind River races with a $1,000 first place cash prize. 1948. 1949, the first Salida through Royal Gorge race. That's today's Fibart. Every year, still going. $1,000 first place cash prize. And in 1949, 22 river trips cruised through Glen Canyon, at least 22. We know that because they signed in at the Rainbow Bridge Register. Many in rubber rafts and kayaks in 1949. So Grand Canyon National Park is getting ready to axe out all their river runners that aren't doing things commercially. River running is exploding everywhere else. The era of innovation happens between 49 and 56. The first rubber boats used on a commercial river trip go through Grand Canyon in 1949. Harry Elson starts that. The first outboard motor boat goes from Lee's Ferry all the way through to Lake Mead, all the way through the Grand Canyon in 1949. The first outboard motorboats show up. From Lee's Ferry, they go down to the Redwall Cavern Dam site. I don't know, River Mile 33, 35, somewhere in there, for the United States Bureau of Reclamation. Wow, I hadn't a clue. They hadn't a clue what they were doing either. I almost flipped that boat right there. Now here's where a tragedy happens to both the Nevilles and Harold Bryant, the superintendent of the park at the time. Now, Harold Bryant wanted to give Norm Nevilles a concession to lead river trips through the park, and Norm was all for it. And then he and his wife died when their small plane crashed in September. Now remember, in 1949, Harry Elson made a trip through the Grand Canyon in a rubber boat, and Norm Nevilles was a good friend of Harold Bryant's, and had told Harold, these rubber boats are dangerous. Harry Elson is unhinged, and you don't want him at all. He's dangerous. So Superintendent Bryant closed the river in the fall of 1949 to river traffic. After Loper and Nevilles died in 49, Superintendent Bryant closed the river to boating. I want to introduce you quickly to these two guys, Bestor Robinson and Otis Marston. Marston knew Bryant, knew the Bryant family. They were from Berkeley. They all knew each other, and Harold Bryant, superintendent of Grand Canyon, would go over to the Marston home for dinner and learn about the river from Marston, because he didn't know anything about it from anybody else. He was learning from Nevilles. Bestor Robinson told him, you can't close the river because it's a navigable waterway. And Bryant opened the river back up that winter to navigation. But he had a trouble. What was he going to do? How was he going to keep these people out? His trouble was the Deacon's Dilemma. The Deacon's Dilemma is the name of that little cute little boat right there. And the guy in it is a fellow named David Jensen. Jensen had run dories in the Atlantic coast. He was a swimmer, a champion swimmer. He was a lifeguard. He'd run little dories on a bunch of rivers. And he was a geologist, and he was interested in uranium, and he didn't want to tell anybody, so he put this little boat together, and he went to Phantom Ranch with it from Lee's Ferry without a permit. And Harold Bryant became very upset about that, and there's an incredible exchange of letters back and forth between Jensen and Bryant. And Bryant responded to Jensen saying, any do-it-yourself river trip attempting a river cruise without a permit, regardless of skill, supply, or craft used, would be considered illegal, and every effort would be made to remove this type of illegal trip from the river. It mattered not if the occupants, like Jensen, were doing just fine. And it's a long backstory behind David Jensen, but I'll leave it at that. October 15, 1951, the river is now a regular highway and it's hard to take care of everybody. Yeah, well, taking care of people like Jensen, that didn't work so well. What Bryant should have done is told Jensen, hey, why don't you connect up at least with a commercial trip at Phantom and run out with them? But he didn't even give him that option. He said, we're confiscating your boat. You will never come back and run Grand Canyon again. 1952, the first female passenger rides a commercial motorboat through Lava Falls. Now remember, Bessie Hyde, first woman to ride through Lava Falls on a boat. Georgie White, 1952, the first female to row a boat through Grand Canyon. Elgin Pierce was along, but he lost his glasses and he couldn't see, and she rowed it. And this is the first rubber boat to flip in Hance Rapid, and they didn't have a permit. And the park wasn't happy with that. I got to tell you about Blaine Stubblefield, the cowboy poet of Idaho. Who? Blaine Stubblefield? Yeah, Stubblefield took a World War II bridge pontoon and put a motor out the back of it and ran Hell's Canyon in 1953. And started doing a bunch of these trips in Hell's Canyon in 53, and they broke across the newspapers of the country, and Otis Marston picked it up and used his copy machine and sent this out to a bunch of river runners, including Bus Hatch. And the next year in 1954, these bridge pontoons show up not only in Grand Canyon, but in Dinosaur National Monument. No permit, 1954, the first bridge pontoon here at the Marble Canyon Lodge. Here is that same boat called the Millipede in Upset Rapid in 1954. And that same year, Earl Eaton and Chuck Bolte took the first motorized bridge pontoon through Grand Canyon with the Little Johnson out the back. No permit, July 1954. Here are those folks at Lake Mead down at Hemingway Harbor. There's Earl on the far right and Chuck on the left. And they picked up a couple of guys at Lee's Ferry, a couple of hitchhikers. These river runners, just can't trust them. April 1955, this is very cool. Bill Beer and John Daggett swam through the Grand Canyon without a permit. A great book came out of this that Otis Marston helped edit. Really just a wonderful trip. I got to tell you, though, the coolest thing about this 55 trip by these two guys was the river trip right behind them. Again, without a permit, Salt Lake City guys in 10-mans, and they saw the craziest tracks on the beach. They saw these kind of weird tracks, and either side of these weird tracks were these big whooshy marks. And these guys had gear bags either side of them and rope going from the bag to the bag. And when they got to shore, they would drag the bags up behind them up the shore. And it wasn't until that other river trip got to Phantom Ranch that they learned these two guys were in front of them, and they passed them at Havasu. This is an amazing time. 1955, William Godby Gibbs, first outboard sport boats went down to Lee's Ferry. 1955, the first paddle boats, Tanner to Pipe Creek with a permit. Now you got to ask me, wait, smarty pants, with a permit? Who gave them a permit? Well, Superintendent Petraw did, and Petraw didn't agree with Tillotson. He thought young kids like this with life jackets, they should be down on the river. They should be out there exploring it and figuring it out. And that was all about to change. 1955, the first Mackenzie River dory showed up. Georgie showed up in 1955 with her triple rigs. And this trip in 55, it was kind of wacky. That triple rig ended up, until Georgie figured out how to run bedrock, she ended up on the left side of bedrock trip after trip after trip. And it was hard getting her giant elephant rig out of there. Took them most of the day to do it. It was the largest trip of the time, 1955, with 28 people. They exchanged 15 people. All the passengers rode the boats through Lava Falls. They flipped the boat, they tore up motors, and they double camped right on top of Frank Wright at Deer Creek. Oh, what a mistake that was. Oh boy. Katie Lee was on that trip, and she wrote some terrible songs about Georgie White. I won't recount them. But what I will say is, I mentioned this was all going to change. 1955, 1956, Superintendent John McLaughlin on the left showed up. His chief ranger was Lynn Coffin on the far right, and head of corridor rangers was Dan Davis in the center. Here's the fascinating thing about John McLaughlin. He was the director of Region 2. Oh, from 50 to 55. Oh, and he oversaw Dinosaur National Monument. And he knew that Dinosaur had solved their means of controlling this type of use with a river permit system that does not encourage boating on these rivers without the services of a competent guide. And so McLaughlin said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to implement a permit system, and it's going to ask for dates of experience through Grand Canyon. And unlike in the past, if you couldn't list experience through the Grand Canyon, you were not going to get a permit. Pretty simple. And there's hundreds and hundreds of letters in the park archives from people who were denied permits. It's really amazing. The 1956 regulations basically barred all do-it-yourself river runners without prior experience, like Norm Neville's, like Georgie White, like all these other amazing people. Who knew? I hadn't a clue. In 1956, in the park's defense here, visitation to Grand Canyon National Park topped the 1 millionth mark. And there she is right there, the millionth visitor. While fewer than 700 people had boated some section of the river from Lee's Ferry to Lake Mead. Okay. 1956, Glen Canyon Dam starts. And that's going to be a big changer for Glen Canyon and Grand Canyon below it. Otis Marston called the era from 1956 to today the era of cruise control. I think that's hilarious. I'm just a hilarious guy. 1959, this sign showed up because of an incredible story I will not tell you about Cadillac, the Airedale dog. That's how this sign showed up here. People down there without permits running the river. 1959, Walt Disney films a movie on the river called 10 Who Dared. The critics wish they hadn't. There are twin Evinrude outboards in the back of this boat, and the guys rowing the boat wouldn't dare put the oars in the water because the oars would jam into their chests and throw them out the front of the boat. So that's 59. 10 Who Dared. We wish they hadn't. Okay. Also then in 1960, the jet boats showed up. 1,200 gallons of gasoline scattered by jet boat all the way down through Grand Canyon. They turned around and they upran. Let's see if this little video will play. Ah, it is. This is John Hamilton. The jet boats were pioneered in New Zealand, and basically there was nobody in America that knew how to drive them, especially in tough rapids like this. And so there were a couple of Kiwis on the trip, and one of them was John here. His dad was the one that developed this boat, and his dad was supposed to be on the trip but broke his elbow. And here's John climbing up through Lava Falls. And there you have it. And he is a happy guy. He blows this rooster tail and almost goes back down the stream again. But that's it. This is 1960. And the uprunning of the Grand Canyon had been happening for 30 years before that. There's a long tradition of that. What's really interesting is the jet boats headed downstream, and just a few days later, this guy came along, Walter Kirschbaum. Kirschbaum was one of the best people on the planet at kayaking in 1960, and here's a shot of him running Lava Falls. You should ask me, wait a smarty pants, how did he get a permit? He hadn't been through Grand Canyon. You're right. he had to demonstrate he could do this by going through Cataract Canyon, and he got a lawyer. Helped him get a permit. Here is Walter Kirschbaum in Lava Falls at 41,000 cubic feet a second. Just amazing. He was, of course, the world champion in kayak at the time, I believe, or one of them. Just an amazing, amazing kayak. So commercial use in Grand Canyon exploded between 56 and 1970. Remember, the do-it-yourselfers, if you hadn't gone before, you wouldn't get a permit. In 1970, an alarmed National Park Service froze all river use as roughly 10,000 commercial passengers and crew and about 300 do-it-yourself river runners made the trip. Remember, if you'd been through, you could get a permit, and there were some do-it-yourself river runners that were down there because they'd been there before. From 4 commercial operators in 56, there were 24 operators in 1970. During this era of cruise control, a fascinating little story here, we're going to wrap up here. In 2004, Grand Canyon National Park reviewed their river management plan, and they had this great chart on page 181, back in the back somewhere, that showed commercial use just really growing up there during the 1960s into 1970, and then use was frozen, but the commercial trips started going faster to get more people through, and we're counting people with this graph, so it keeps going up because the trips are getting faster. Look at the non-commercial people down there. Okay, I remember looking at this in 2004 going, gosh, it's really curious. I wonder why that happened. And now I know why that happened was because in 1956, the do-it-yourself river runners could no longer get permits. And they couldn't keep up with the concessions because they couldn't get permits. And this is a key issue here that you all need to know. So here's a photograph, a really interesting little photograph from June 2018. 121 commercial trips with almost 3,000 passengers launched that month, while 45 do-it-yourself trips with 557 passengers launched. This is June of 2018. This is an artifact from 1956. I just find that fascinating. In February of 2020, it was a do-it-yourself lottery for the 2021 river season with 7,826 applications for 426 permits. Wow. Well, we're wrapping it up here. History isn't over. History is alive. History is today. And this spring, so cool. In 2020, 4 tandem canoes with 8 people did a self-support trip through Grand Canyon. It had never been done before. History is still happening today. And again, not only I didn't tell you the half of it, I didn't tell you 1/10 of 1% of it because I'm running late. And this is a fundraiser for the Riordan Mansion State Park. VishnuTemplePress.com. Head over to that website. You got 7 days. All proceeds from website sales go to support the Riordan Mansion here in Flagstaff. And with that, Sasha and Nikki, I hope you're around. And if we have some questions, we'll start picking them up.
Thanks, Tom. There is a couple small questions in the chat box already. Your tragic era probably included Everett Roos.
Excellent question. The tragic era, did it include Everett Roos? No, it did not. Remember, Everett disappeared outside of Grand Canyon National Park, up in Glen Canyon. And the 13 people who died on the Colorado River from Lee's Ferry down to Lake Mead that's just that tragic era. Wasn't looking up basin. It was just looking at Grand Canyon. Good question.
The next one's from Brenda. Ken Curtis. Wonder if relation to Gunsmoke's Ken Curtis, Festus.
I haven't a clue. Does anybody else know? Maybe if you know, you can put in the chat there. And I haven't a clue.
And Randy said a little vacation that got out of hand. I'm not sure which trip he was talking about on that.
A little vacation that got out of hand, that's the Bill Beer and John Daggett swim of the Grand Canyon. The name of their book is We Swam Grand Canyon, a cheap vacation that got a little out of hand. It's what a fascinating story about that. The book recounts a little differently what happened when Beer and Daggett hiked to Phantom Ranch, from Phantom Ranch up to the rim for a decent night's sleep at the hotel there. They got scooped up by the park rangers and taken to the superintendent. And what the Park Service said in their letters to regional director and then on to the director of the Park Service was that John Daggett was one of the Fred Harvey Daggetts, and they weren't going to stop him from doing anything. That's you won't find that in the book. It's a little different.
Let's see. You're getting lots of comments about how great the presentation was.
Oh, good. It's fascinating giving these Zoom presentations. You get zero feedback, no laughing, nothing. I can't even tell if you're hearing me. I'm going on for minutes and minutes, and I can't hear a thing.
Folks, you are welcome to unmute if you have questions. I am going to have Sasha stop the recording so that we keep it at a reasonable time. We do have a few more questions coming in, but if you want to go get to unmute yourself, your next question is, are you for or against permits?
Am I for or against permits? That's a great question. I am a firm believer in permits. Really, you say? Yes, I say. Because if we didn't have permits, Grand Canyon would be overrun with people. And remember, the river in Grand Canyon is supposed to be protected for its wilderness qualities. And we just, wilderness requires restraint. It requires humility and management. It requires us to take care of the place and not overrun it.